Welcome to Breaking the Silence. This is our very first episode officially where we allow a Close Encounters witness, Daphne Fletcher, to come forward for the very first time and tell her story. Daphne, break your silence.
It began in Wakanda, Washington. I was living in northern Washington, right on the border of Canada, on the northernmost highway that runs east and west in our country, which is Highway 2. And this extension was Highway 20. And I owned a ranch and a store and a restaurant and cafe and post office and gas station, and we had a ranch behind the place. My brother lived with me for a while, and when he went back to Michigan, I had a friend move in, and actually I had several people living there at various times helping out to run the place. We had jobs for probably 10 to 15 people, and it was a very remote place and quiet and beautiful, mountainous, forested. I loved living up there, but we'd fallen on hard times. I'd manifested everything very quickly, and it was quite an adventurous period of my life, and this was the last chapter, and the economy had taken a turn. It was the 2008-2009 economic crunch. We had finished, it was the very last night. Everything had just resolved. We had just sold the place. I had just finished packing everything up with my friend Bill that lived there with me, and all of the furniture was moved out. I just picked up the check from the escrow office, and it was the last night, and so we had a celebratory campfire in the fire pit behind the house for the last time, and I was really excited already. It was the happiest day, and Bill was excited but sad, and we had a nice campfire, and we were going to go over to his mother's house afterwards because I no longer had any furniture in the house. And we finished the fire, we put it out, and we were coming around the house, and we got to the driveway. All of a sudden, just right there, it was just absolutely astonishing. It blocked out the sky. It was so big. And we both just stopped dead, frozen, looking up and looking at each other and looking up. Oh my God. Oh my God. Holy shit. Oh my God. Looking at, are you seeing this? Oh my God. And just back and forth looking at this astronomically large spaceship hovering above us, just above the trees. And there were two of them, and one was the biggest thing you could possibly imagine in the sky, blocking the whole sky. I could only barely see a little bit on either side, so it was definitely longer than it was wide, and it was facing south, but it was just huge. And there's no way something that big could be just in the sky, not making any noise, no ground disturbance, nothing. And there was a little triangular right next to it. And they both were just frozen there. It just stayed there planted for, I think, at least a minute. We looked at it, maybe two. And then it just went whoosh across the sky, poof, gone. Just whoosh and poof, nothing, and gone. And we both looked at each other. Did that really just happen? And we both were just flabbergasted, but neither one of us were afraid. We just were excited. It was the most exciting thing either of us had ever seen. And the strange thing, though, it was much later that night when we got to Betty's house. It was at least an hour, maybe 2 hour and a half longer than what we originally thought. We thought we were going to get there at about 11 o'clock, and it was like 12:30 by the time we got there. And so that was really late. And Bill was just beside himself. He was just flabbergasted. And Bill was developmentally disabled, but he didn't lie or exaggerate. And so his mother, I think she laughed at us at first, but he just couldn't stop going on and on and on about this event. And so I know she believed us by the time it was over. And I stuck it in a box and never talked about it again for years after that. I left the wilderness that night. That was the last night there. And I walked away from the experience and just didn't talk about it for years. So when I moved to Southern California, right after I had my near-death experience and I went to Egypt, I got back from Egypt and I saw another UFO, which it was another super profound experience. I was in the park at McKinley Park in East Sacramento, and above the park, but off in the distance, there was a giant triangular ship that was, I thought I could see 6 lights or 7 lights that were 2 apexes of a triangle, and I wasn't sure if it was 6 different ships or if it was one ship, but then I could barely make out the outline of it in a like a boomerang shape, like the Phoenix Lights incident, and it was huge, and it moved across the sky a little bit, and then it stopped, and then it shot straight up in the sky. And I never heard anybody talking about it, but I called my best friend that night and told him all about it. And I was really excited about that experience and the other things that had been happening in my life. And it was just all kind of moving the whole experience forward, that I started remembering experiences again. And I started having vague recollections of being a child, and the sleepwalking experiences, and grinding my teeth, and the night terrors, and talking about it to my family, and them convincing me that it was just my imagination. But these things started coming back, and it propelled me forward into exploring more and more and starting to read things. So my spirituality really became important to me, and I was following Abraham Hicks, and I started going to seminars and workshops, and one of the questions that was asked was about UFOs and extraterrestrials, and their answer was very meaningful to me. They replied that instead of them being so much extraterrestrial, that they're more extra-dimensional, and that made sense to me, and that they're more on the angelic realm than alien, and it started to normalize the whole experience for me rather than making it seem so freakishly crazy. And so I was able to start following Bashar as well. And I had a private session with Bashar, and he suggested getting hypnosis. And it still took me 2 more years to do it, because this whole process took years for me to start slowly accepting. And I was saying the book Communion, I couldn't pick up the book Communion for the longest time because it frightened me. But Bashar helped ease into it, along with my spirituality and meditation and the communication from spirit, because it's all connected, I think, the spirituality. And I don't think the ETs separate it all so much. And so I finally was led to Yvonne, and I had hypnosis, and it opened it up. It just blasted it open, and it was really hard for me for the last 3 years. It's been 3 years since I had the hypnosis sessions, and even to listen to my sessions, it's really hard for me to listen to them because they're scary, and I was freaking out. And that night that we saw these ships, it turned out that it was just the last minute, and that when we were coming around the house, we were met and we were lifted up onto the ship. And remembering that, it was so strange, but when they put us back down, it was the end of the experience, and that's what we saw when they left. And they made us to forget that hour before. And I was so amazed and elated to have the experience, but coming back to reality and the material world and bringing this experience with me, I still feel crazy. Yes, we were supposed to meet up in Montana, and we had planned this trip. It was in 2020 during the pandemic, and I just purchased an RV, and I was picking it up in Spokane, and I was going to drive it over to Montana to meet my son. And a blizzard came out of nowhere in September, and I was stuck in the RV, and we couldn't go anywhere. And so my son came from Montana to Spokane, and so we had an opportunity to shift the trip that we were going to have, and I couldn't think of anything else to do, and all of a sudden it just seemed appropriate to go visit Wakanda. And in the car ride up there, I told him the whole story about the UFO, and I showed him where it happened in the backyard, and we walked through the whole thing again, and I hadn't relived it since that night, and it all was so crystal clear. And I think reliving it with him and showing him step by step where it all happened, he believed me. And then we went from there over to Bill's house, and I got to introduce him to my friend Bill, and Bill corroborated my story and told him what he remembered. And this was right before Bill died, and it was very meaningful to me to take my son up there and to have him not reject the story. He believed, and I could tell that, and that was a big shift for me to start being able to share it with other people, because he's really the only one that matters. And some of my extended family might reject this and think I'm crazy, but the only one that really matters is my son's. Again, during the pandemic, my company was kind of shut down. We weren't able to work, and things had been going really well with my own company. I had a bunch of new projects, and we had a lot of growth, but the pandemic shut us down. And then I remembered what my friend had said about taking over the company, and it felt hopeless that I was going to take over the company, but out of nowhere, an investor appeared and said, and made it all happen. And it felt miraculous. how every piece of my whole life has been like this. That just when things look bleak, then something shifts and everything magically works out. And I wound up with the company that I was fired from 3 years before, and it magically happened on my birthday that I wound up with it, and I was able to call my boss that had fired me 3 years before, and I got to call him up and say, hey, guess what? I just bought your company. It felt pretty amazing. Through my publishing job, I just started writing again, and I think I should mention, though, back in 2016, I had a near-death experience that was significant. And my psychic abilities really became very sensitive after this near-death experience. And it really shook up my life in the things that were important to me. And this has kept returning. Even though I go back and forth, a pendulum swinging on skepticism and belief, and I go back and forth, and I'll believe it for a minute, and then I swing back and I put it all away for a while. And then the most important thing, though, I keep coming back to is this, and telling my story and getting it down at least and sharing it. I just feel compelled and to deal with it too, to face it myself and to really explore it and to find out if I'm crazy or not, or if this really happened. And then timing, like the congressional hearings in our country slowly starting to shift, it all overlaps, and I have all of these synchronicities. And just one thing after another like this, and Bashar kept saying too, to follow your passion and unconditionally. And so I kept going back to writing this book and getting this story together and going back to Yvonne and hypnosis, even though the hypnosis was freaking me out. Depending on which period of my life we were going back to. And that's where I started seeing this pattern. And when I was a really small child, I wasn't afraid of them. And I loved them. And then it shifted when I became a little bit older, and I didn't know why I became so frightened of them, and I couldn't remember. And we explored that through hypnosis, and it was because my entire family was taken aboard a ship, and my dad, watching my family freaking out, really freaked me out too. And my sister and I thought this was a ghost experience our whole lives, and then the hypnosis showed it wasn't. And my whole family being lifted up and paralyzed, not being able to do anything. And then my sister and I, after the experience, we were so freaked out. My dad had to carry us to our cabin, and we wouldn't look up, and we were buried in his shoulder, carrying us to the other cabin. And so it was that experience that shifted it for me. And I had night terrors and PTSD from a very young age. And I had no trauma that I ever recalled until much, much later. And when I talked to my dad about UFOs, he had a UFO experience when he was a child with all of his siblings. They all saw it together. And my dad grew up in a rather affluent family. His grandfather, or Grandpa Saley and Grandma Saley, owned the Cadillac and Buick factories back in the 1940s. And huge factories. He employed over 1,000 people and had a mansion on Lakeshore Drive and so did Henry Ford, and he was actually friends with Henry Ford and had backdoor privileges. And then when my grandpa Saley passed away, the family had a fall from grace and lost the factories, and my dad wound up working for Ford, and while he grew up riding around in Cadillacs, I grew up riding around in Fords, and it's just kind of ironic, driving down Lakeshore Drive when I was a kid, looking at the Christmas lights, and then pointing out, this is Henry Ford's house. And when my great-grandfather died, my grandpa Fletcher got a job for Lockheed Skunk Works here in California, and came out to California and was going to bring the whole family out. And they all came out and were at a motel in Yucca Valley, and they were playing behind the motel, and they saw a bright orange orb, fireball, and my dad's like, "What's that?" And they all were astonished, and, "Oh, it's just the moon," and the moon's over there. And so they all went screaming back, or excitedly back to the motel, and my grandfather sent them back to Michigan, and they separated. My grandma and grandpa separated at that moment. And I always wondered why, it just seemed weird, but that synchronicity, that the night they saw the UFO was the night that my grandma and grandpa broke up, and he stayed out here working for Lockheed, and they all went back to Michigan and had their lives. But my dad never saw any more UFOs, but he never forgot that one. But my uncle did see a lot of UFOs when he was in the Marine Corps. He was a pilot in Vietnam, and he said that they saw Foo Fighters all the time, and then he saw them afterwards too. Anyway, but I started seeing more weird things after my near-death experience. I started remembering more. I started getting more spirit contact. During my near-death experience, I felt like I popped up out of my body in the hospital and through a tunnel, and I saw all of the spirits of my dead loved ones there to welcome me. And it wasn't just them. There was others behind them. And I now know those to be ETs. There was a whole group of those that loved me all there. And everything started speeding up in my life after that. Everything, the connections, like bringing me together with the right people at the right places and times. And then I found Yvonne. And the thing about finding Yvonne, though, that was really strange, when I finally became willing to start exploring this, I started reading books, and I found the book by John Mack, Dr. Mack. And in the middle of the night at 3:33 in the morning, he woke me up. In a dream, he kept nudging me to get up and go look on the computer. And he led me to Yvonne. And I reached out to her that night, and sure enough, she reached right back out, and she needed help with books too. And so it was like serendipitous that she was so willing to work with me and help me with this hypnosis, and I was able to help her with her books, and I started reading her stuff, and it's just profound, and I knew we were brought together for a reason, and the hypnosis, just like the abduction movie by Dr. Mack, it was just mind-blowing how it just the memories are just back, and it's not like your imagination where you can conjure things. It's like a dump. All of a sudden, all of the memory is back, and it's profound. Breaking through that veil and all of a sudden it being there. And that first hypnosis session was like that. I was going through the dark, and all of a sudden we broke through the memory. During my first hypnosis session, I think the most profound thing was that it was so different than what I remembered. And yet it was an extension of the same experience. And when I came around the house and I met the 3 ETs, or extra dimensionals, that were waiting there, they lifted me up and I could see the ship, but it was different. It wasn't laying down, it was standing up. And we were going into the very bottom of the ship, not the side of the ship. It was the bottom of the ship, and it was open and lit up, and it was shining a light down us, and we lifted up into the ship. And then when we came back down and were placed back down on the ground, the whole ship shifted and laid down on its side. And then when it shot off, it went off like that. But it had been standing up straight. And I think when it came down like that. And then it was just frozen there waiting for us. And that difference in the hypnosis session was so profound, the shift, because I didn't remember that at all. And I didn't feel like I could imagine that part. And it was just so real. And it made sense that in order for it to go that way across the sky, that it should reposition itself. Because if it was standing up, it wouldn't have, I don't know, but it just, that was the biggest part of that first hypnosis session that really surprised me. When I was met in 2010 on Wakanda that night, I was taken aboard to see my hybrid children that night. And I'd been doing it many times. And all of a sudden I could remember all of this and interacting with them on numerous occasions. And Bill had to be laid down on a gurney-like thing. But I walked with them through that hallway. And I willingly went. I was happy and excited to see my children. And remembering this, going from being so afraid to even face this, to having these memories that are deep and clear and there all of a sudden, it's profound. And it took me a long time to deal with it again in my regular life, you know, going to Rotary Club, you know, and dealing with my clients. I work on history books normally. I don't really work on supernatural stuff. And so going back to and having all of this, it was just, I go back and forth, you know, and I'll talk to friends, and going to Sero meetings and these support group meetings was hard. It actually chased me away even for a while because I felt weird, really weird. It's just been something that I've had to look at slowly, but I'm compelled to do it and I can't stop. And it feels like the most important thing in my life, but I can only handle it in small doses. And I don't want people to think I'm crazy, and I don't want to feel crazy. And sometimes I still do. So I meditate a lot. And I write a lot, and the most important thing right now is finishing this book, and it's the book about my ET experiences. And so it's almost finished, but I'm still not quite ready to share it with the world, but this is helping me by talking about it. And I just feel like it's the most important part of my life, and it's the most important part of the current part of our story in civilization. This is what the big reveal, and it just happened last summer and everybody missed it. It was anticlimactic for most people. And so in my near-death experience, it felt like my whole family and all of my loved ones were there to welcome me to the other side. And in the background, I could see these beings, these light beings is what they felt like at the time, angelic beings. And they felt like an extension of my family. ETs, but connected, and it was all my family. And I've shifted to this belief where I feel like we're all one big family, and we're an extension of them, and that's why they want to be in our lives today.
I'm sure you'll agree with me, her story was moving, emotional, and very real. One of the things she talks about that I want to address, because I don't want to go on in great detail. For me, her story was enough. It says it all. She broke her silence. She started the process of sharing this with the public, despite the fact of feeling crazy. And I want to address that. We all feel crazy, every single last one of us. We are programmed by our society, by our culture, by our people, to believe that whatever goes up must come down. And anyone who has these experiences knows that's not true. It's not true at all. But despite all that, because of all the programming and the stigma that's been brought onto us by the media and by skeptical scientists that go way beyond skepticism, closer to debunking, we're shy about it, and we question it ourselves. We really do go back and forth, as Daphne talked about, between it wasn't real, it is real, it is real. And then every time you talk about it, no matter who you talk to about it, there's this part of you that feels like, I must be crazy. That's completely natural. And to any of you who may come forward and talk about your experience on our show, it's important that you know that. It takes a very brave person to come forward and talk about this stuff, but in time, we'll all come forward and talk about it, and the public will know that we are not alone. And it's okay to break your silence, because more and more of us are coming forward, and more is coming out in the news every day that's legitimate and realistic about this subject. I hope you enjoyed this first episode. I hope you were moved by Daphne's story, and we'll see you next time.